which is something we know is punishment. It's not protection. It's documented to have really deleterious effects on a person's mental state, depression, suicidal activity, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote a very just blistering commentary on the effects of solitary confinement last year. I mean, this is a known thing, and this is happening as a matter of course to people for quote unquote for their own protection. So, you know, it continues to be a problem, and we're litigating it. We're also using public education and advocacy and harnessing the media to make sure that, you know, general people, including people who care about social justice issues but probably don't think about this issue, or LGBT issue but don't think about this issue as an LGBT issue, join the fight and raise their voices up so that we can get to the day when this isn't, as a matter of course, what transgender people, especially transgender women of color, have to endure while they're incarcerated.
I will say, I think, unfortunately, because this has been so openly tolerated in prison contexts, you know, the abuse comes not just from other inmates, but also from staff. You know, I've been in contact with multiple transgender women whose rapists were prison guards. And when they reported it, they were, again, put in solitary confinement, you know, like Demoya described. And so it's really just showing what a culture of indifference to trans lives, you know, what that creates as far as, you know, risk for everyone who's part of the system. Now, something that Ashley mentioned in her video, of course, is the role of healthcare denials and the experience of transgender people. And, you know, again, that's pervasive, and that's something that's changing only through litigation, you know, like the case that Ashley, you know, courageously brought. But we're seeing in prisons across the country that, unless they're told otherwise, or in sort of their hand is forced, that, you know, the entire panoply of healthcare that's, you know, prescribed and recommended for people with gender dysphoria is being precluded and being denied to trans individuals. And so that's everything from hormone therapy, that's any allowances with respect to gender expression and grooming. You know, Ashley and others like her have been threatened with, you know, having their eyebrows shaved off because they're arching them. Ashley was put into solitary confinement for an extended period on the allegation by a warden that she was pretending to be a woman. So not only, you know, are people not being affirmatively allowed to express their authentic selves, they're being, you know, punished, frankly, and put into the disciplinary system for just who they are. And, you know, certainly anyone that wants medical care beyond hormone therapy is, you know, finding that to be almost impossible. It's only through very recent advocacy by TLC, Ace's organization, or one of Ace's organizations that we'll be discussing a little bit, that some of that's changing for certain people. But again, it's sort of, I mean, Ashley had been receiving hormone therapy for 17 years. She'd been living as her authentic self in her community as a woman for 17 years, gets to prison and is told, you're a man in a man's facility, and if you don't act like it, you're gonna be put in solitary, stop being a sissy, you know, and that's the reality. That's the reality unless we litigate, and that's really depressing. And I think, you know, the other component of that is staff harassment, which Demoya can also speak to, but that's pervasive. We're talking about, you know, individuals who have no option to leave, right? You don't sort of get to check in and check out of prison. You're stuck there, being told on a daily basis by everyone they encounter in a uniform that their lives don't matter, and that they're just delusional, and that you're not a woman. I don't know what you think you are. I mean, we're talking about being misgendered on a daily basis by everyone you encounter who's an authority figure, being told again that you're not a woman, you know, and people go out of their way. It's like, you know, crossing the hallway, oh wait, look at you, you know, like, again, man in a man's facility, man in a man's facility. We actually took the most fascinating live testimony in a hearing that we scheduled in our case for Ashley, of the woman who was purportedly the warden of care and treatment at Georgia State Prison, had been in the role for 25 years, testified under oath confidently, without blinking an eye, without sort of, I wonder if this sounds kind of funny, that she had been encountering transgender individuals, women, for that entire time, and that her policy and what she had instructed all of her staff, everyone involved in the care and treatment of transgender individuals, that these are men, they should be addressed as men. It doesn't matter what pronouns they want to use, it doesn't matter what, you know, what they want to say. These are men in men's facilities, and her guidance and instruction and marching orders to everyone who reports to her at her prison is to do the same. And so this is the universe that we're dealing with, and it's bleak.
Yeah, I mean, it's universal. I mean, Passion has stories upon stories about being harassed, about being called a faggot, about just guards just going out of their way to say crap like, oh, you know, has legs almost like a real bitch, or, you know, like just this is constant, just all the time. And it's against federal law. I mean, PREA actually requires that staff be trained to interact respectfully with LGBT people. And of course that includes not calling people slurs and derogatory names, not going out of your way to make LGBT people's lives miserable, which is, it seems like, is what happens all the time. And so, you know, it's heartbreaking, but we're continuing to fight against it, and I do think raising up the voices and raising up the experiences of women like Ashley and Passion is a really, really important part of that, so people understand that these are human beings who are essentially being tortured in various different kinds of ways all the time.
Yeah, I think, you know, obviously, you know, you've heard from what's being said about these two trailblazing cases that have been litigated, that the situation is dire, and I think sometimes that in addition to the inappropriate harassment and just you know, negative treatment, I think that the thing that's sometimes looked over too is that many times a transgender woman has been on hormones already for a number of years preceding incarceration. So they may have fully developed breasts and other you know, physical characteristics, certainly biological differences that pose significant health risks. You can't just, you know, when you just automatically just stop hormones that you've been taking for a long period of time, it's you know, we've actually had doctors that work with our organization issue policy recommendation, again, from a medical perspective, just saying how extremely dangerous this is. And if you can just imagine a trans woman who may have developed breasts and have other physical characteristics being forced to have a strip search in front of a room full of cis men. I mean, just from just a safety and privacy and just, you know, a perspective of just humanity of another woman, I mean, that is just outrageous. So it's no mistake too that very oftentimes the people that we are in touch with who are incarcerated just get to the breaking point that they really can't handle it anymore. We see suicide attempts. We see just complete mental breakdowns and physical, just a number of different health problems from correctional facilities throughout the country having patterns and practices of denying hormones. And we have litigated this issue in California in two groundbreaking cases where we've gotten the California Department of Corrections to essentially give hormones for women who have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And recently, really within the past year, got courts in California to actually rule that by law, gender-affirming surgery has to be given as well when it's deemed medically necessary. So we've definitely been litigating in this issue, and you know, the situation is dire, but it has not been without struggle to improve it in a better direction.
So thank you for taking us to that next point. So we've heard about what our folks experience. So now I want to talk about, because the work is being done, and unless you fight, you can't win. So let's talk about what some of that work is, how it's being done to attack the drivers of incarceration for trans people.
Yeah, thanks so much, and I'm happy to kick that off. And you know, I know that we've been talking about really heavy things. Our panel probably should have come with a trigger warning. but we can take a deep breath and realize that there are a lot of really committed people in this fight, people at this table, people in this room, people all across the country, lawyers, non-lawyers, community organizers, activists, people like Ashley, and Passion Star, who made their voices instruments and tools for change. And I think it's having an impact. And so, tackling the drivers of incarceration, we obviously all believe is really important, as well as sort of trying to improve conditions for people, who are in lockup. And so on the front of just these drivers, a lot of organizations, a lot of activists, a lot of people, have become thought leaders about how to improve education for gender nonconforming and trans folks. We have brought at Southern Poverty Law Center a number of cases regarding bullying in schools. There is a educational law, Title IX, that prohibits sex discrimination in education, and that's been interpreted to mean that teachers have to stand up for students and can't become part of the problem or bystanders when gender nonconforming and trans youth are being mercilessly bullied in schools, at the alarming rates Demoya cited earlier. And so we've brought 2 cases now, one called Anoka, which my colleague who's in the audience, Sam Wolf, devised and sort of brought through, lots of labor and lots of strategizing in a Minnesota school district that had the effect of, completely shutting down a series of practices where not only were students being bullied at alarming rates, there was actually an educational policy in the state that teachers, both couldn't intervene and couldn't say anything about what it meant to be not heterosexual, to students. And so they were offering literally no resources or funds of support for students who were, in crisis. And at the time the lawsuit was being devised and filed, there was a suicide crisis in these Minnesota schools. I think 8 or 9 students had taken their lives in a short period of time because of how toxic their educational environments were. And this lawsuit had the effect of leading to a consent decree that's still being monitored and enforced in connection with, I believe it's the Department of Education and Justice, perhaps. Sam is nodding? Okay, good, got that right. That's completely reformed the way the schools do business there and made teachers resources for students who are LGBT once again. We had a similar result in Moss Point where the principal was calling a lesbian student a dyke, and it was that kind of environment. And we were able to reach a settlement that, again, has sort of changed the way that school does business. And obviously, as Demoya alluded to, there's a lot of work still to be done with educational policies and legislation around student bathroom access and locker room access. And so I think Demoya's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, and Chinyere alluded to some of the tools that we have, Title IX being a major one. We've used that law and also constitutional claims. We've at times been able to use local and state anti-discrimination laws where they exist. Right now, 19 states and DC have laws on the books explicitly protecting bullying, explicitly prohibiting bullying based on gender identity and discrimination based on gender identity. By my count, and anyone in the audience can correct me if they know differently, only 2 of those states are in the South, Arkansas and North Carolina. So we'll move for North Carolina. And there may be local laws at the kind of local jurisdictional level. That's just at the state level. So mostly Title IX remains the main kind of tool that we use, and the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights is the main kind of government agency tasked with enforcing that, and they have luckily been very active in the last few years in making it clear that Title IX's prohibition of sex discrimination includes discrimination based on someone's gender identity, transgender status, or perceived failure to live up to gender stereotypes. So we've been using these tools in a variety of ways to work on behalf of transgender students, including advocacy and education, filing lawsuits, litigation, filing administrative complaints with the Office for Civil Rights, and also doing a lot of policy work and legislative work. So to give just a few examples of some of those, at Lambda Legal, we've been sending a lot of educational letters to school districts and school boards across the country to kind of educate them about white as a moral and on some level of health and medical, there's a prerogative to affirm everyone's gender identity in schools, including transgender students, and also to let them know not only it's a moral and the right thing to do, but it's the law. The law requires you to do this, and we don't usually say this outright, but you could be sued, probably by us, if you don't do the right thing. So we've been doing that, and a lot of that has been kind of, there's this organization called the Alliance Defending Freedom, I think is what they stand for, ADF. They've been peddling this letter of their own, basically telling the schools that they should and have to discriminate against transgender and gender nonconforming students. So where they've been popping up, we've been kind of trolling them. Whenever they pop up, we pop up. So we've sent letters, kind of combating their letters in a number of school districts across the country, and we've affirmatively sent letters, usually when a student or a student's parent reaches out to us for help. In Tennessee, which is one of the places where one of these, several of these bad bathroom bills have popped up, we successfully were able to convince one of the one of the legislators there who was going to propose a bad bill to not do that. Through the work of our colleagues in our Atlanta office that Simone heads up. Unfortunately, there's no dearth of legislators seeking to attack transgender kids, so there is actually another bad bill now pending in Tennessee that we're fighting to kill in conjunction with other national and local organizations. We also have a pending complaint with the Office for Civil Rights right now on behalf of a student in Minnesota, in Michelle Bachmann territory. She's no longer active, but I saw on TV the other day, I'm like, where did they find Michelle Bachmann? Why did they give her up? But kind of where she kind of used to reign in Minnesota, we filed a complaint on behalf of a Native American transgender male student there who was being banned from using the bathroom, and that's, OCR decided to open an investigation, response to our complaint, and that's working its way through their system. So we're hoping to get a really good result there. I think a good result kind of in the Midwest area there will be a good model going forward. And you all probably know about the GG case. That's ACLU's case in Virginia on behalf of Gavin Grimm, who was a transgender male student who was being barred, is probably still being barred, yes, from using the male bathroom at school in Virginia. That case, they tried to get a preliminary injunction, which was denied, and that's being been appealed to the Fourth Circuit. I think the decision is pending any day now. And TLC, Lambda Legal, a bunch of other organizations filed amicus briefs in those cases, in that case, to pretty much educate the court about the importance of affirming the gender identity of transgender kids, about the correct interpretation of Title IX, and DOJ and OCR weighed in on that too. And with the brief that we actually filed in Lambda Legal, I think is a really important brief. It's not a legal brief, but what it does is it presents the voices of school administrators from across the country, a variety of states, a diverse number of states who have actually implemented transgender inclusive policies, to say, look, we've done this in our schools, and not only has nothing bad happened, it's actually become a very important part of us creating a safe and affirming environment for all students. So I think that was a very important thing to put before the courts, and we've been able to use that in other advocacy and other contexts as well.
Yes, and also in the employment context, we've had at TLC a lot of success in the last couple of years through bringing cases to the EEOC. We had a trans woman contact us who was applying for a job with the federal government. Her name is Mia Macy. And Mia's, highly qualified. She's going through the application process. They tell her everything looks great. You have the job. The only thing we need to do is do a background check, and everything's fine. And around that same time, or exactly at that same time, Mia was starting to transition from male to female, and let her boss know about this. suddenly, even though she didn't have anything in her background check that would prevent her from getting the job, they said, well, actually the funding for that position, that's no longer available. So actually you're not going to be getting hired. And then she later found out that the job, the funding for the job hadn't been cut, but had just been given to someone else. So she filed a complaint with the EEOC that we joined in representing her on. And this was in 2012, and we got the EEOC to say for the first time that sex discrimination also bars discrimination against trans people in an employment context. So that was huge. That was huge. And why this is important really for everyone in all 50 states and not just for federal employees is if you work at an organization that has more than 15 employees, if you're discriminated against on the job, you can always file a complaint with the EEOC and get a right to sue under federal law for discrimination. So I think sometimes the tendency is to rely so heavily on looking at all of the variations of discriminatory practices that are even, and lack of protections on the state court side, but there certainly has been a lot of movement that have given people rights and opportunities in federal court. And then, later after the Macy decision in 2014, we brought another EEOC decision because the Macy case had just sort of been limited to, okay, well, just because you're trans, you're transitioning, can you be denied access to a job? We then had a case of Tamara Lusardi, who was already in her job when she began transitioning. She let her employers know, okay, I'm going by a different name now, my pronouns are changing, and this was totally not respected. They continued to misgender her willfully and intentionally. She was in fact denied access to the women's bathroom at work. And was told that she would have to use a single stall bathroom that only she was required to use. And so we went back to the EEOC and again claimed, okay, this is discriminatory practice. And we were successful again. Denied those types of patterns of behavior, denying access to bathroom that's consistent with a person's gender identity, that type of harassment, intentional misgendering, we were able to get a favorable decision from the EEOC on those matters as well.
And I just want to underscore how awesome the work that Ezie and TLC is doing. At the Southern Poverty Law Center, we've been going around the South in really unfriendly jurisdictions and bringing employment cases for transgender people. We represented this past year a woman who was from Alabama who was denied a job at a nursing home. She began her first day. They, were doing the background check or looking at her license at that point in time and said, uh-oh, and she was basically walked out the building, after being offered this position. And, being able to cite things like the Macy decision, we sent demand letters, we contacted the EEOC, and lo and behold, I'm getting a call from the other people's lawyers saying, okay, how much money do you want to make this go away? And that's in Alabama. And right now we are litigating a case called the Broussard versus Tower Loan case. That's in partnership with the National Center for Lesbian Rights and also local partners. And that's a case that the EEOC has taken an interest in because it involves a transgender man who was working in Louisiana at a kind of small bank, title lending bank, so not our favorite types of actors in the South, but he was fired from his job after being presented with a paper that said, you know, we understand you think you're male, but for this job and purposes of this job, you need to identify as a woman, follow the female dress code, and when we do business trips, you're going to be housed with female colleagues, and you know, sign here if you agree. And he said, I don't think so. And so, you know, he's out of a job, and the EEOC, you know, is taking an interest in this case and has actually intervened as a plaintiff, citing the, you know, that there's a public interest in employers not taking measures like this. And so I think that this work is really important. And again, as Asa said, while there's a lot of messaging, a lot of fear mongering even, among even people who aren't part of this community, that, you know, married on Sunday, fired on Monday, you have no rights, you know. It's actually not true because of the advocacy folks are doing. There's even a recent case, I'm not sure, I'm forgetting it, was it Fox? That actually expanded.
Baldwin versus Fox, or Fox versus Fox.
Yes.
Baldwin versus Fox, yes.
just a couple months ago, there was another EEOC decision that actually is expanding this idea of sex discrimination and what it encompasses to actually extend to sexual orientation discrimination. And that was a case involving a gay male plaintiff. And, you know, it said, well, hey, if you're, you know, discrimination based on sex means you can't fire trans people. That's gender identity discrimination. That's covered. You can't, you know, fire people that fail to conform to gender stereotypes, expectations. That's, you know, prohibited. And you can't fire people for their sexual orientation. And so that's really groundbreaking. And again, it suggests that if you at least go to the EEOC first as the person who can be a protector and enforcer of your rights, that you're actually going to get pretty far as someone who's LGBT or T.
Yeah, I mean, I won't add too much to that since we're low on time. So we'll move on to housing. That's obviously, housing is also a vitally important aspect of trans rights advocacy. I mean, people who are, I mean, we know that transgender and gender nonconforming people are at increased risk of being housing insecure or homeless, and that's a really powerful driver to interaction with the criminal justice system and ultimately becoming incarcerated. So part of the work that we're doing on that front is litigation based on housing discrimination, but also advocacy around things like safe and equal access to shelters, which are disproportionately utilized by people in our community. So just quickly, you know, we've been doing all kinds of work, but we filed a lawsuit last month on behalf of a family headed up by two women in a relationship, one of whom was transgender. They were exchanging emails with the landlord, prospective landlord, for a long time. Everything looked like it was going to be great. She was like, yeah, you guys are a perfect family. This is what we're looking for. They showed up to look at the place, and later that night she emailed them and said, after talking to my husband and my psychic friend who has a transvestite friend, anyway, I have decided that I can't rent to you all because of your unique relationship. And, you know, she kept citing their uniqueness and her fear that renting to them would damage her stature in the community. This is in Colorado, but I think it's going to be a really, hopefully, groundbreaking case. We brought suit under the Fair Housing Act and under the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Statute, arguing that she discriminated against them based on the fact that they were two women. So sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity because one of them is transgender, and familial status because she also kind of threw the fact that they had kids in there as a reason that she wasn't going to rent to them, which is also illegal. So we sued her under all of those. So that, you know, that lawsuit just got filed and it got a lot of media traction. And I'll just say this, one of our favorite headlines that came out of this was, because this woman purported to be a psychic healer, the woman who discriminated against them. So the headline was, psychic discriminated against family, didn't see lawsuit coming. So you know, litigation is one aspect, and as I alluded to, we are also doing advocacy around equal and safe access to shelters. So Chinyere can speak to that.
Yeah, and I'll be brief, but you know, we do have a lot of committed advocates in the administration right now, which I think is good news. I don't know how that changes come January, but the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, actually on its own spearheaded, with advocates' encouragement, spearheaded initiative to issue regulations that would make it clear that agencies, shelters, etc., violate the law when they don't allow transgender people, gender nonconforming people, to be housed according to their self-proclaimed gender identity. And so that's a huge development, because right now we know that part of the reason why the homelessness problem is so vast in this country is that there are not safe shelters where people who are LGBT or specifically T can go to and be housed with the people, you know, for whom, you know, their gender identity corresponds. And so, you know, yes, if you're a transgender woman, maybe you'll sleep on the street and not in a shelter if you know you're going to be housed in a men's facility, and vice versa if you're a transgender man. And so we are really hoping that these regulations, when implemented in their final form, will really sort of change the game for the homelessness problem that we're experiencing.
Hey, so do you want to talk about policing?
Yeah, so we've also at TLC really, you know, police aren't the most fun people to work with, but we know that they are in our communities and they are interacting with trans people. So what we've sought to do is within the police policy and employment manuals, get you know, model policies passed within these police departments for how police interact and treat trans people. So things like using the correct name, using the correct pronoun with people. We put that into their personnel policies so that we have a leg to stand on if you know, we're trying to bring a case with a trans person who's been harassed or discriminated against by the police. So we've done that in Los Angeles, the city of San Francisco, but also in places in the South as well. You know, the Atlanta Police Department also